Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and aloha. Thank you for the opportunity to have us join you remotely. My name is Pua'ala Pascua, and I'm joined virtually by my colleague Eleanor Sterling. It's our pleasure to present on behalf of our larger co-authorship group on the topic of when global sustainability goals meet local actions, specifically via a case study and lessons learned exploring multidimensional well-being in the Pacific Islands. At our organization, the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation of the American Museum of Natural History, and together with many of our partners and collaborators, we really firmly believe that improving and maintaining healthy human and ecological communities requires a clear and thorough understanding of the social, economic, cultural, and environmental connections that exist between people and their surroundings. To achieve this, we use what we're describing as a biocultural approach. And for us, that's an approach that explicitly builds on local worldviews, knowledge systems, and management practices used in combination with methods to incorporate evidence from multiple sources and scales. Such an approach should begin with an understanding of locally grounded priorities and needs that inform community interactions with and management of natural resources. It should also account for the availability of existing data and/or the feasibility to connect new data. The use of inclusive, participatory methods to identify resulting metrics and indicators helps us to ensure that these are culturally appropriate, monitored in a way that respects people's livelihood strategies and time limitations, and ultimately provide information that's relevant for local decision-making processes. Engaging community members to reflect on and choose the resulting metrics is an essential part of the process because it supports community empowerment and ultimately improved environmental and social outcomes of resource management initiatives and interventions. You may be familiar with the term indicators or metrics in natural resource management, and these are really essential because they help us to summarize or otherwise simplify relevant information. In the natural resource management field, indicators represent observations and resulting metrics that help us to monitor and communicate about the condition of something in order to make better decisions. Indicators can help us to measure things like the state of something, for instance, number of organisms, percent area coverage. It can also help us to track trends. Are things getting better or worse? And as one of our colleagues really clearly articulates in a 2019 publication by Dax et al., indicators can be extremely useful in that they help us to measure perceptions, knowledge, and practices as a result, change in those perceptions, knowledge, and practices as a result of management interventions. That said, it's key to point out that indicators don't always represent reality. And what we mean by that is what indicators are measured and how they're measured are dependent on the value system framing the indicator development process. Sometimes the value system of those creating and measuring indicators may be quite different from the value system of the communities in which indicator monitoring is occurring. For instance, addressing human and ecological well-being separately could mean that the interlinkages between people and nature are overlooked, which can consequently result in conflicting or misguided approaches to decisions. In addition, we know that policymakers heavily depend on the use of gross domestic product as a representation of well-being. And while this may be valuable information and metrics in some settings, if those classifications are also altering the ways that people perceive themselves, this deficit thinking, so to say, we want to make sure that this doesn't result in misdirection of resources or, in worst cases, changing local value systems that may have been in place prior to these classifications. In creating and evaluating metrics, it's important to recognize that while some of these had really good intentions going into it, it's not always proportionate to their on-the-ground impact. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Eleanor.
Thank you, Pua'ala. And one of the most recent groups that we've been working on is an opportunity to try to better understand how local and global definitions of success in conservation and sustainability overlap or differ. This is really important because of those things that we talked about earlier in this talk about those disconnects between the value systems and the types of indicators of success that are used by local communities versus those outside of those communities. We did some work across the Pacific, as I was mentioning before, where we were trying to better understand how people talk about, understand, and measure healthy systems. It was pulled together in this Dax et al. Publication from 2019. We worked with community organizers, community members across the Pacific to try to synthesize what are the most important characteristics of healthy environments and healthy people. We were able to pull those into 8 main categories that are shown by these icons here. Our intent was to help guide community efforts to report on what matters to them by providing some structure to what they report on, and then allowing us to be able to compare what's important to people in these groups from the Pacific with what international folks are using. So we thought these categories could serve as an interface for discussion across scales to help to avoid some of those disconnect problems that we've seen in other places. And one global arena where priorities are being set that have an impact on local people and places is within the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They're essentially the global go-to framework of reference for sustainability. National governments, regional funders, and even private foundations and non-governmental organizations set their goals, priorities, and spending strategies based on these SDGs. There are 17 of these goals, all of which are associated with particular targets and indicators. And we tried to look at 160 of these indicators, and for every single one of these indicators, we asked, could this indicator measure something that's important to people in the Pacific? And through this process, we wanted to see if there were gaps or overlaps between what's important and measured at a global versus a local level. And what we found, as is depicted here, is that there are some aspects of the SDGs that are focused in on, for instance, human health and on financial capital that are very, very, very well represented. Those things that are important to people in the Pacific, there are multiple ways that those are measured in the SDGs. Whereas we found there were some critical missing pieces that the SDGs underemphasize, very important characteristics of strong local communities, like understanding connections between people and connections between people and place, and understanding local and indigenous knowledge. And so we've been able to translate this information to even further outreach capabilities, and Pua'ala is going to mention those now.
Thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, so based on these research findings and similarly drawing from and building upon some of the experiences we previously highlighted, our SNAP working group developed and released a set of outreach materials for national and multilateral reporting using locally and culturally attuned metrics. These materials take the form of a series of guidance documents, which range from introductory documents of relevance to anyone interested in the topic, through to really detailed lists of questions and prompts that national level reporting agencies could consider when they are evaluating existing indicators or developing monitoring plans. These modules are available online at the link that you see here, and while they were primarily developed for national level reporting agencies and international or regional funding bodies in the Pacific, we know that their components are likely to resonate across regions and groups. Ultimately, these documents are intended to enhance cross-scale indicator efforts by focusing on ways to adapt existing national or global indicators, and may also be useful for groups who are actively generating their own indicators. In response to some of our partners' interest in sharing and exchanging information, the CBC helps to manage an online curated directory of resources on nature culture indicators and knowledge systems. This directory, again available at the hyperlink you see here, combines tools and resources like toolkits and reports, peer-reviewed publications and videos that showcase indicator efforts around the world. With that, we'd like to close today by acknowledging the following individuals and organizations who have made this work possible. And we'd like to thank all of you for your time. Should you have any questions or wish to reach out to us in the future, our contact information is listed there. Aloha.